We're very happy to have, right now, I think there are 66 people in the room. Some are also watching in the live stream in Facebook and yeah, the Facebook page of UGAT and SDRC of LaSalle. This event is co-sponsored by the Social Development Research Center of De La Salle University and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology in Ateneo de Manila University. Of course, this is an initiative by Ugnayang Pang-Aghamtao, the organization, the only organization of anthropologists in the Philippines. This event is part of a series of events falling under the umbrella of annual conference of UGAT. If you don't know, this year actually we're having regional conferences in Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. So today we're beginning the first leg of the Luzon Regional Conference. So you can see on the screen the titles of the succeeding webinars. So after today, there will be one tomorrow, and then all the way to November 20 for Luzon. Tomorrow, actually, Dr. Mary Racelis, a faculty member of Sociology and Anthropology of Ateneo de Manila, as well as actually of Anthropology Department in UP Diliman, will talk about encountering knowledge partnerships through Zoomstahan and cell phones. So you can watch out for the link in the Facebook page of UGAT as well as our website. The next event is a roundtable discussion on integration of IP education in HEIs. This will be moderated by Dr. Maria Mangahas of UP Diliman. And we have as discussants, Sir Ponce Benagen, Mr. Abadiano, Dr. Abaya, Dr. Batani, and Dr. Gonzalez. So if you're interested in the topic, again, just watch out for the link in here. I think nasa bottom part ng poster, as well as you can also look for the link later in our Facebook page. And then what's next here? The next, okay, so that's it for the Luzon, the Luzon webinars that will be coming in the next few days. For today's webinar, before we begin, I'm just gonna announce some house rules. So please make sure that your microphones are turned off during the whole session, especially if our speaker is presenting. Also turn off your cameras to conserve bandwidth. You can post questions through the chat box. You may also raise your hand during the Q&A if you want to ask the speaker a question. Please also close any running notifications or apps to avoid disruptions in the internet or video lagging. Put your screen on speaker view. And at the end of the webinar, please submit your evaluation. A link will be provided later in the chat box. Next slide. All right. This is the link of the evaluation form. You can also take note of the code here. Maybe someone in the secretariat can also type the link here in the chat box, so it's easier for the participants to click it later. All right. Next slide. We also want you to invite everyone, or those who are interested in joining UGAT, Ugnayang Pang-Aghamtao. You can read the details in our website. Our website is ugat-aghamtao.org. There will be instructions there on how to be members, what are the qualifications for you to be a member, among others. We are a happy family of anthropologists and related or allied disciplines in the country. And we meet every year for annual conferences. Some of you, I'm sure, have attended our earlier annual conferences. And this is the first time we're holding the conference online, no? And we would very much welcome you if you want to join us. Next slide. All right, so for those who want to receive certificates for this webinar, you can also visit the website, and particularly this, this page in the website for instructions on how to get certificates. Thank you. What's the next slide? Are we ready to? Okay, so we will start with invocation. This will be a short invocation, and then it will be followed by the national anthem before we proceed with a webinar proper.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas. Kayang magiliw, helas ng sinakalan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyag ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisigil, sa nagagang tutok sa simoy at sa langit mong bangaw, ay hinatang tulad, awit sa pagkayang minamahal. Ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na naghihingi, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pamay di magdidinig. Lumang ang araw ng walhaging pagsinta, mo'y langit sa piling mo. Ang inigaya na pagkay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil. Mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
All right. Again, welcome to the webinar. I hope everyone is well. In the past few days, especially people in Luzon, have suffered a lot of challenges, and hopefully we're all beginning to recover. Um, Before we let our speaker proceed, with his lecture, I would just like to read a brief bio note. Gideon Lasco is senior lecturer at UP Diliman's Department of Anthropology and research fellow at Ateneo de Manila's Development Studies program. He obtained his medical and master's degrees from the UP College of Medicine and his PhD from the University of Amsterdam. A recipient of the Palanca Award for Essay, he maintains a weekly column on health, culture, and national affairs in the Philippine Daily Inquirer, as well as a newly launched column in Sapiens, the online anthropology magazine that focuses on the relationship of humans with other living and non-living things. An advocate of health equity, Dr. Lasco was selected as an Atlantic Fellow for Health Equity in Southeast Asia for 2019. He's also involved in environmental research and advocacy, building not just on his academic background, but his lifelong pursuit of mountain climbing. He is a trustee of the Center for Sustainability, an environmental nonprofit organization based in Palawan, and the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. His collection of essays, The Philippines is Not a Small Country, was published by Ateneo Press in September of this year, and his ethnographic monograph on human stature has recently been accepted for publication at the UP Press. So everyone, let us please welcome Dr. Gideon Lasco.
Hello, everyone. A very good morning to all of you. I believe that, okay. So it's really a pleasure to be here at this moment. And I'm so thankful to UGAT and to De La Salle for inviting me to join you today. I'm joining in from my hometown of Los Baños. So we were also affected by that food last week. So I wasn't sure that I'll have internet connection today, but thankfully I managed to have it in time for this webinar. So thank you for all the organizers. Greetings to all my fellow anthropologists and our attendees from Mindanao, Visayas, and Luzon. And I would also like to make a special mention to all our students, both graduate and undergraduate, who are with us, as well as our friends overseas. I would like to begin, because this is the opening talk for the Luzon bit of UGAT conference this year. I would like to begin by acknowledging the struggles that we have faced all year, both at the personal and professional level. Tension, which is central to the anthropological thinking, continues to haunt us to suspend classes or to carry on, to take a break or to work even harder, to be productive, to pretend to be productive, to get by, to get bored, lonely, even anguished sometimes. So I am sure that you will agree with me when I say that when events like this, we are resisting in many ways our own emotions, trying hard to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but it is not easy. And today I think of people trying to cope with floodwaters together with their pets, animals, crops being destroyed, of contagion, complicating efforts to address disaster after disaster. But there are moments of happiness too, often in unexpected ways. Do you remember in August when we were faced by a new lockdown, on top of a seemingly endless quarantine? And for many of us, the need to prepare course maps and brace for a brave new semester. And then what happened? An ostrich appeared and lit up our faces, our Twitter feeds, our families like never before. Actually, two ostriches and even a goat. It was a collective moment of levity after long months of difficulty, made possible Not by the most creative TikTok vlogger, but by runaway flightless birds. The ostrich in Quezon City reminds us that this is foremost a more than human world. In our house, here in Los Baños, we have two olive-backed sunbirds that forage for our in a small garden. So I managed to take a photo of one of them, the male. You can recognize it as being the male because of the neck having this color, this blue color. So we have these two olive-backed sunbirds that forage for nectar in our bougainvillea shrub in particular. And while they belong to a particular species, they are two distinct individuals, one male and one female. Like our two dogs, Grizzly and Newton, sunbirds can live up to 12, even 15 or more years. So they've been around for a long time, and I hope that they'll continue to be around for more years. The ostrich in Quezon City reminds us that definitely, and together with the animals in our house, so there are many people, many, not more than humans around us. We have plants, we have animals, we have pets, we have livestock, and we have microbes as well, including bacteria, viruses, and fungi. But to go back to the ostrich, what can explain its appeal? What can explain its virality? And I deliberately use the word virality because it's a metaphor that based on a process affecting all of us. What can explain the appeal of the ostrich and friends? Of course, there's the novelty of it. Its sheer size as a giant bird. We're not used to normally have this big bird running around. Its rarity as well. If there's thousands of ostriches around, nobody would care for one or two. But it is also perhaps the fact that its mad dash in Quezon City is a transgression of the world as we expect it. Roads, we think, are for people. Ostriches belong to the zoo, or in the wild, or in video games as Chocobo. To see them on the streets has a subversive quality, especially at a time when humans themselves were, and still largely are, confined to our houses. In the videos and circulated in social media, it is notable that people actually talk to the ostrich. People actually talk to the ostrich. Bawal dyan. Bawal, wala kang gate pass. So in its macroness, in the macroness of this ostrich, in its relative size as compared to humans, it seems amenable even for conversation. Ultimately, sadly, the ostrich died and was cooked. One of the ostriches died was cooked, turned into adobo, eliciting some outrage because such a cute animal should not be eaten. We anthropologists, of course, would have immediately bracketed such responses in terms of cultural norms of what is good to eat. Meanwhile, there are questions of legalities of keeping an ostrich in a subdivision. The DNR officer gleefully pointing out, kung manok nga bawal, ostrich pa kaya. Aside from the ostrich that went viral, what other species and quasi-species have animated our lives this past year? Now, surely what I have been saying so far will register with many of you as part of the turn towards multi-species anthropology and the conceptualization of the Anthropocene, or the idea that human influence in our world is such that it's a geologic epoch in itself. And also under the rubrics of STS studies that see humans as enmeshed, entangled, imbricated in networks with non-human actors and agents. I acknowledge the inspiration from this body of work, but I will not rehearse the literature this morning. As the cultural geographer Hayden Lorimer puts it, to do so will likely bore the most devoted and risk baffling the uninitiated. In fact, I would identify with the latter. There's so much to learn in this field. There's so many concepts, still ongoing discussions about non-human agency, which I will also elide in this talk. Also, the purpose of my presentation is not to litigate the contours of theory of this turn, but more pragmatically, to apply its overall approach to the pandemic as it is happening in our country. What is more useful for this purpose then is to highlight the fact that this perspective or set of perspectives has long animated our national anthropology. There is no better evidence than the 2018 UGAT conference in Puerto Princesa, which I'm sure we all remember fondly, many of us remember fondly, where we heard presentations from human seaweed relations in Tawi-Tawi and human-elephant communications in a zoo, to living with crocodiles in Batara sa Palawan and living with cats in Philippine urban places. We saw the same the following year in Baybay Leyte, with a focus on food and nutrition, inevitably bringing about entanglements with other species, notably in a panel on feeding other animals, and also the attention to root crops. So this comes to us also not just as part of global anthropological currents, but from our own interlocutors who have long thought along these lines, not just as a way of thinking, but as a way of living. As our wealth of ethnography, not to mention folklore and cultural history, show, local notions of ecology have always seen the world animated by more than human actors. When Bay Inatlawan, one of the indigenous leaders in Bukidnon, I met last year as part of my fieldwork among forest guards in Monkey Tanglat, when she performed a ceremony in April to pray amid the pandemic. She mentioned the trees, the birds, and Philippine eagle in the same breath as humans and the virus. This local knowledge is vital, not just in asserting the local nature of our anthropology, but also in tempering our aspirations as to what these can mean, as to what this multi-species perspective can mean for the world. In a recently published article by Will Smith on human-pig relations among the Palawan, he rightfully warns against a post-environmentalism that assumes that these effective relationships would always be based on loving and caring. So, in other words, even if we write about human dog relations, we cannot assume that every relationship between humans and non-human animals will be based on loving and caring. This warning echoes the insight of Padmapani Perez in her book Green Entanglements on conservation in Benguet and Borneo, where she points out that we cannot idealize indigenous peoples as noble green savages. In any case, what all of these works offer is a recognition that we must account for the non-human and chart our complicated entanglements with them, moving them, following Agamben, from the level of Zoe or bare life to that of bios, with legibly biographical and political lives, or grounding them in ethnography. In other words, these works endorse, in the language of Eduardo Con, an anthropology that is not just confined to the human, but is concerned with the effects of our entanglements with other kinds of living selves. On a personal note, my own thinking towards this direction was inspired not just by my own fieldwork and all of these works from my fellow Filipino anthropologists, but also my personal life growing up in a mountain. I grew up in UP College of Forestry here in Los Baños, and also climbing mountains all my life. Before the pandemic, I had the opportunity to visit the Amazon rainforest and the Galapagos Islands, and where I saw a glimpse of what a world would have looked like without humans. Because the species there were able to evolve undisturbed by human activity until a few centuries ago. But within a few centuries of human settlement in Isabela Island, for instance, guava trees have invaded hectares upon hectares of land, inflicting harm on the ecosystem. So when I was climbing a volcano there were so many guava. I was eating guava along the way, but the locals tell me that it's actually harmful to the species there. Interestingly, however, there are studies now that show that maybe the giant tortoise, which is very endangered, is actually enjoying the guava. It's actually healthier for the guava, for the tortoise, all this guava, which also reminds us that there are unexpected consequences of plants that travel to different places alongside humans. So we've been traveling, plants have been traveling, microbes have been traveling, which is why we have these travel bans. Darwin's finches, I was so shocked that the finches were just approaching humans without without fear of harm, with evolutionary innocence, unaware of the havoc that we have brought throughout much of the planet. So my visit in the islands reminds me of environmental writer Robert Parlane's call to imagine ourselves as inhabitants, not just of a human lifetime or a generation, but also of deep time. Besides, it is not just a matter of academic fancy or emic fidelity that we ought to do this. We ought to do this perspective. Today, as we live through a pandemic, or more aptly, a syndemic, I hope Mary Racelis will talk more about this in her own talk. A multi-species perspective is not just a fancy theory, but today an ecological and even an existential necessity. Like Aragorn in Lord of the Rings, telling King Theoden that open war is upon you, whether you like it or not. A multi-species perspective is upon us, whether we like it or not. 10 years ago, perhaps living with the viruses can be a title of a conference or a panel or a paper, but today it's a catchphrase by politicians and physicians alike. We are learning, via the hard and painful way, what Donna Haraway calls foolishness of human exceptionalism, or as Jane Goodall averred, it is our disregard for nature and our disrespect for animals that has caused this pandemic. Indeed, the pandemic has forced us to grapple with a world where we are vulnerable, even through the air we breathe, a world where microbes pose an existential threat. So how can anthropology, how can we account for the interspecies encounters in the time of COVID-19? First, of course, is the encounter between humans and microbes, including bacteria and the coronavirus itself. Technically, viruses are not species because they don't fulfill the criteria of an organism in biological texts. But anthropologists have labeled them as quasi-species, and in any case, they are part of a multi-perspective because part of this perspective is also to question the relevance of these biological categories, species, genera, phyla, kingdom, etc. And of course, all the different subspecies that we have created upon ourselves. Let us bear in mind that in the 19th century, anthropology would have included attempts to even divide the human species into Homo sapiens africanus, etc., in what we want to move on, definitely, and what we now roundly reject, but is part of our history that we must also grapple with. Now, microbes, we focus first on microbes. They have been around for billions of years. Scientists tell us they're the earliest organisms, hardy enough to survive in the depths of the earth, the deepest part of our ocean, and speculatively, perhaps even in space, as the recent brouhaha over possible life in Venus suggests. But as far as humans are concerned, they are a recent existence. And naturally, people never viewed illness as caused by microbes prior to their discovery. Even Jose Rizal, whose medical practice came at the twilight of humoral theory, opined that el aire, el calor, el frío, el vapor de tierra y la indigestión son las únicas causas patógenas que se admiten en el país. So winds, heat, cold, vapors of the earth, and indigestion are the main causes of illness in the country, according to Jose Rizal at the time. That was the thinking at the time. Malaria means literally bad air, still reflecting this pre-Pasteurian provenance. The Pasteurian worldview, however, which today remains the dominant mode of thinking about microbes, sees the world as made up of noxious microbes against which we must treat with antibiotics or prevent with vaccines. In the words of MIT anthropologist Heather Axon, this view explains why people blame colds on germs, demand antibiotics from doctors, and drink ultra-pasteurized milk and juice, while politicians on the campaign trail slather on hand sanitizer. So this is before the pandemic. This also explains the appeal of safeguard commercials. So I'm showing you this slide of a safeguard commercial in the 1980s that have always depicted germs in the body as being eliminated 99% of the time or thereabouts. And the highlight as well of this pastoral view are antibiotics and vaccines, both of which comprise the basis of a public health optimism that imagined a world free of disease. And of course, that such thinking did not age well. Not only are humans increasingly affected by non-communicable diseases like diabetes and hypertension, but microbes have adapted to antibiotics, and today antimicrobial resistance is a growing threat. So yung penicillin that they discovered in the early part of the past century no longer works for many bacteria. And viruses are particularly difficult to diagnose and treat, and because they too can evolve, can mutate, and especially when they cross species. In some ways, this pre-Pastorian worldview still has not left us, with microbe and wind melding in people's conscious conceptions, as when President Duterte interprets airborne transmission to mean that COVID-19 is nasa hangin. But the outdoor hangin that people might imagine as being the vessel for virus does not correspond with biomedical understandings of what airborne viruses are more likely to be at, which is in indoor, poorly ventilated spaces. So there's a disjuncture between the way microbes are imagined and the way they are conceptualized in biomedical practice. This germ consciousness may also not even conform or correspond with Pastorian notions of viruses. As Michael Tan noted in the thousands, it can be amusing. So the idea that food drop in the floor isn't necessarily dirty if it hasn't been in the floor for a certain time. So, ay, wala pang hulog yung pagkain. Diba? So, let's say, what if an ube cheese pandesal fell off the floor and you ordered that ube cheese pandesal from this really highly acclaimed store, and then while you were about to eat it, it fell on the floor. Will you eat it or not? So there have a lot of amusing discourses. Ay, wala pang 10 seconds. Ay, wala pang 30 seconds. And that is tied, according to Michael Tan, the childhood concept that the dropped food scares off the germs. So there we fear toilet seats, believing the germs lie in waiting, ready to pounce on the vulnerable. Terms like kumakapit, I'm still quoting Michael Tan here, terms like kumakapit sa germs show that their mode of infection are not often well understood. And Tan also notes that he found villagers speaking of intestinal parasites, bulate, as adult germs, mikrobyong naging laki. So, because we don't see these things. We don't see these things. I'm reminded of how multi-species anthropologists speak of biologists in the same vein as anthropologists who speak in behalf of their indigenous others. He compares this to biologists speaking on behalf of non-humans who cannot have no voice and must be represented. And these insights resonate today when people talk about, how do people talk about COVID-19? Some of them say, madapuan ng virus, matamaan ng COVID. When President Duterte joked that he wanted to slap the virus, he was reaching for an object. The microscopic, which is beyond our sensory faculties in terms of its scale, is semantically transposed to language to facilitate our ability to visualize and conceptualize it. On top, of course, of technologies that render the virus visible. So this is the difference between the pandemic now and the pandemic in 1918 and before. So unlike these plagues that did not localize onto a tangible object that we can visualize and imagine and even turn into a mascot, there's an objecthood to the pandemic today thanks to these technologies. Indeed, we visualize this virus as this red pathogen with spikes. And these spikes are actually relevant because it's where the vaccines, this is what the vaccines are trying to address, the spike protein. So they are not insignificant. But viruses actually don't have color. They're not red. The red comes from human attempts to visualize it. And somehow they agreed, okay, we will all agree to paint it red. But this is red tag of the virus. This is painting the virus into a color that it doesn't have. It's too small to be in the visual spectrum. You can read up on articles on physics that talk about how it's actually impossible for viruses to have color as we know it. But such is the certitude of the virus existence as this red spike that food writers even compare the rambutan to it, much to the outcry of many Filipinos and Southeast Asians. So this is a very interesting illustration of scale. And even these microbes, this microbial life, can also vary. We are more different than an ant. As a bacteria can be different from a virus. So even within the microscopic world, there are scales that also matter. But we do not see this and we do not imagine this. So this is quite fascinating, this idea of scale and how technology we rely actually on scale. Interestingly though, at least before the pandemic, anthropologists have been documenting a shift post-Pasteurian view. So I talk about pre-Pasteurian, Pasteurian now, and post-Pasteurian view that view microbes not as harmful, but as neutral and in ways potentially even useful. So from Yakult, so I will hopefully, you can hear this interesting imagery of Yakult. So we increasingly see microbes can actually potentially beneficial, including these discourses. Like I find it really weird and curious to see these microbes anthropomorphized in this Yakult commercial. I wonder how this will like, how will this will view like in this time of COVID-19, where we really imagine microbes as noxious. But from Yakult to yogurt to kefir and even kombucha, we are patrons of microbes today. And arguably, now more than ever, we recognize microbes and macrobes alike as what Donna Haraway calls companion species. The microbial presence in the human body is even more profound. In medical school, we are taught about the normal flora in our body. So apparently, there's bacteria all over our body and viruses. But in fact, it's much more than that. And they're learning more and more. The human body contains more bacteria than cells. Outnumbering, so human cells are outnumbered by bacteria 10 to 1, making up about 1 to 3% of the body mass, of our body mass. So pag tinanggal lahat ng bacteria and virus in our body, that's worth 2 to 6 pounds of matter. And they play a vital role in human health. 50% of oxygen. So we're surrounded with plants. I saw Sis Guilty with his plants, and we have plants. I'm gonna talk about plants a bit later. But 50% of oxygen comes from microbes and not from plants. This recognition has led people to question the need even to wash hands before the pandemic. People were questioning that we might remove all the bacteria in our body, and many of them are good, in fact. However, the pandemic has suspended, I argue, that has suspended or superseded this paradigm. It has renewed our suspicion for microbes, helping make sense of the rituals of disinfection that people do, and many of them may not even make sense from a public health perspective. People are suddenly vectors of a virus, even though we've always been exchanging microbes all along, not just COVID. My doctor friends tell me that they're getting less cases of flu right now and other viral infections right now, also because of the quarantine for COVID-19. The divergence between local and biomedical knowledge of microbes can have public consequences, as when this tension is adjudicated by powers that be. As when President Duterte decides that 1 meter is enough, so 1 meter is enough to protect people from the viruses, but not less than that. And we see this as what Paxson again calls microbiopolitics, the recognition and management, governmental and grassroots, of human encounters with vital organismic agencies of bacteria, viruses, and fungi. So the interesting thing here that I want to end this bit about microbes with is that this microbiopolitics figures in the conceptualization of vulnerability and resistance. As when people say, and I've been hearing this in communities, rural and urban, ang tibay ng mga mahirap. So people are saying that, well, we must be immune. We see Duterte and other politicians also say this. There's this, I hope you can hear this bit from the president about Filipinos have more antibodies, and then squatters. Wala doon siya nakitang taga-squatter na tinamaan ng virus. So it's very interesting to see how this maps on into microbiopolitics, which draws striking parallels with the resilience narrative that we hear in the time of typhoons. Resistensya is to the physical as the resilience is to social, and both are used to justify health and social disparities at a time of pandemic. Now, beyond the virus itself, and alongside it, animals are involved in the pandemic in various ways. As Deleuze and Guattari write, we form a rhizome with our viruses, or rather, our viruses cause us to form a rhizome with other animals. Animals figure in the genesis of the virus jump to humans. The bat and the pangolin, we'll talk about this. They also figure in ways humans cope with the virus, and entanglements that range from abuse to affection. And I do not just refer to dogs being able to detect the presence of the virus, even though this is an amazing reminder that our sensory universe doesn't overlap with dogs and other animals. At the start of the pandemic, animals figured in two major ways. First, there was the question of which animals serve as intermediate hosts. Pangolins were proposed as intermediate, and for Filipino environmentalists, this struck a chord given that the pangolin is poached heavily in Palawan and brought to China, brought to other parts of the world. Eventually, suspicion fell on bats, and this is still the current view, tentative but current view. However, I would like to emphasize that bats have always had coronavirus. In the Philippines, a study in 2010 found that bats in UP Diliman and UP Las Baños, interest, how convenient, diba, for researchers, but also our campuses are thriving, multi-species and ecosystem, so it also makes sense. 50% of the bats found in these two campuses had coronavirus, had a kind of coronavirus. It's a family. There are many coronaviruses. The question, of course, is how the virus jumped for bats and humans, and why bats have come such close proximity to humans, whether through our diets, our activities. So while the exact mechanism of how this happened is still tentative, these narratives are not free from cultural ideologies, including the othering that comes with the virus, the othering that comes with nutritional practices. For example, that exoticize the Chinese, for example, as people who eat all kinds of animals. But this indictment, but we move back to the non-human animals. The indictment of certain species as carriers of viruses is a matter of life and death for them. In various parts of the world, millions of chickens are culled as a result of fears of avian flu, leading Celia Lowe, the anthropologist, to describe those chickens as part of a viral cloud of H5N1 in Indonesia. Over the past few weeks, almost 3 million minks, so these are rodents, were killed in Denmark over fears of spread and potential mutation of the coronavirus through them. To quote one BBC report, mass graves have appeared in the Danish countryside filled with the slaughtered animals. Farmers are in tears, but the concern is more about their lost livelihood than the lost life of the rodents, whose fur is used to make leather goods and fake eyelashes. Unlike the ostrich, which when turned into adobo sparked outcry from some, certain species do not attract as much sympathy, a further reminder of our local and moral taxonomies. Another way in which animals figure pandemic is via the narrative of nature's revenge, or that of a healing planet. Especially during the first parts of the pandemic, we saw images of animals trooping the streets, from dogs, carabaos, buffalo, etc. Kangaroos, I'm sure, in Australia. But as many environmental scientists have pointed out, COVID-19 is actually not, in the ultimate sense, good for the environment. PPEs are contributing to plastic waste being consumed by fish and birds alike. people's economic deprivation is leading people to engage in the hunting of endangered species. We already saw two tamaraws in just a matter of at least two tamaraws in a matter of months in Mindoro being hunted down, and other destructive activities. Zoos and wildlife parks are losing revenue and funding, leaving animals vulnerable. I'm sure many of you saw this pitiable sight of this starving lion in Malabon Zoo. Beyond the material consequences of a pandemic to animals, social scientists are quick to add that narratives of a healing planet present a simplistic view that reinforces the apartness and separateness of humans and so culture. Of course, animals do not just figure as part of the etymology of the virus or its ecological impacts, but in the experience of it. Dogs and cats are serving as companions, especially in the time when we cannot be with other humans, immune as they are to the rules of physical distancing. Already, there are this emerging literature from other countries that talk about how human-dog relationships were disrupted during lockdowns and how the presence of pets became more important, and how the constant presence of humans in turn have engendered a new kind of intimacy between households of humans and non-humans alike. All of the above point to the pandemic as a more than human event that's happening with us. And let me add that more than animal too. Very quickly, so the outline of this talk is such that I talk about microbes and then non-human animals and now plants. So very quickly, I want to touch on this fascinating development, which is the proliferation of houseplants. As I bike around in my home province of Laguna, I see tricycles transporting plants, plants being sold on the highways. There's traffic. I thought there was a newly opened store, but in fact, it was SUVs, cars lining up in this famous store of plants along the highway in Laguna, in Bael, Laguna. Social media too is bustling, overgrown with monsteras, carnivorous plants, all cacti, all kinds of plants, and not just for the upper and middle class. I see people in low-income neighborhoods walking with their plants, tending to their small gardens. Now, many Filipinos have long cared for and nurtured plants. The first description of bonsai by a Westerner actually was in Manila in 1603 when Morga talked about this miniature plant in a house of a Chinese merchant in Manila. Over the past decades and years, we have seen the increasing popularity of plants, but especially now in the pandemic. So you can see this. I acquired my own plants as well, part of this fascination. So I bought this Stephania, this bulb, which is also, I saw it on Instagram. So it's very interesting that people are turning to plants. Now, what's interesting with these plants is that they come from different places, finding their way from the colony to the metropole and back to the colony, in this case, the Philippines. The bougainvillea that our sunbirds love actually originally came from Peru or Brazil. The cacti in your rooms may have come from the deserts of South America or Africa, Central Asia. So they come from all over, from Madagascar, from West Africa. The monstera that sells for thousands of pesos on Instagram comes from Central America, I think, as well, and South America. And some of the ferns that we have come from our own mountains, prompting DNR to warn against the collection of these species. Isn't it ironic? One of the people I've been talking about plants told me he admitted buying plants from overseas despite technically being restricted. He tells me that plants are able to travel much more freely than humans in a time of pandemic. Another notable observation as far as plants concerned is that how growing a number of people are naming their plants. I'm not sure if some of you have named your plants, but to name is to confer importance. Humans only give names to people and things that matter to them. And while mostly said in jest or in levity, being plant parents, plantito, plantita, this establishes forms of kinship that are arguably new, at least among some groups of people. Finally, there's also a growing, so look, it's grown. The plant has grown from this one leaf to four leaves. Very fascinating. But there's also a growing concern with the value that we place on plants. And this applies to our thinking about species. What happens when a species, a certain kind of species, suddenly has value? And what happens when this value becomes quantified? Plants hold immense value, but they have to be literally uprooted for them to realize this value. Like trees in the forest that are more valuable dead than alive. Given that today certain kinds of ferns sell far more than kilos, even sacks of rice, how will this shape our mountains? How will this shape our agricultural lands? How will this affect our farmers? At a personal level, of course, plants matter differently to different people. Some may see them as a project to be shared with others. Others may see nature in them, even as they are far from natural, given all the interventions that humans have done to bring them to where they are, from the pots, to their shape, to their breeding, to their commodification and their marketing. There are those who see health benefits in plants, and I believe that it's increasingly supported by science. There's this notion of biophilia and how humans being surrounded by nature can actually make them much healthier. My own thinking about plants is that on top of these things, they also serve as links to the past and are enduring lifelong companions. They serve as projects at a time when life itself seems precarious. They offer an alternate vision of life, one of growth and regeneration. The question, however, is can our newfound affection for plants translate to heightened concern for the planet? So this is a plant of my mom. She got this when she was in her early 20s, and they were still living in an apartment in San Pablo. But it has followed her for 2 decades, 3 decades. And it is from a potted plant, it's now in the garden and it's grown into a big plant. So it's been there. I just ignored this as a fixture. But when I realized how it's actually traveled with my family, with my parents, much longer than I have a renewed respect for the plant itself. But can this newfound affection for plants translate to a heightened concern for the planet? That's the question. So this one is actually with me here. So makikita niyo siya. That's now, it's grown. Lumalaki na yung kanyang mga dahon. And it is a span of a month. So in light of this necessity of multi-species ways of thinking about the world, our mandate is clear. And that is to act on the implications from the personal to the political of our more than human togetherness amid the precarities of our time. Personal level, this can simply mean a greater appreciation of the world at large, perhaps making us less lonely wherever we are. Here in Los Baños, we have not welcomed a single guest since the pandemic, but the sunbirds are still here. In fact, while doing this, I'm actually hearing them in the bougainvilleas. I know by their voice. Our two dogs, the narratrice, and even the Stefania that I've been nurturing. They also raise the stakes of who and what we are responsible for during this time. While thanks to the process of co-evolution, our companion species rely on us. However, we can also draw strength and inspiration from them. At the personal level, at the professional level, meanwhile, thinking of and about interspecies connections should enrich our practice and broaden our conceptions of the field to include other animals, other species, other beings, living and unliving, and what they do, what they mean for the people we engage with. Following analyzing, we must analyze how nature comes to being rather than seeing it as a mere backdrop for human activity. Methodologically, this entails following species as they travel and as they continue to travel in the milieu of a pandemic. How are Notamagnos cats? How are Kelvin Meneses monkeys? Phil de la Cruz pet? We need to go back to our interlocutors, human and non-human, and see how they are living together during this time Amid constraints brought about by the pandemic, we need methodological innovations, such as the ones that I think will be discussed in the coming events in UGAT. So I invite you also to join those events because virtual ethnography is so valuable right now, and many other methodological iterations that we must do. Research ethics protocols must adapt to these changes and to facilitate what some anthropologists are calling emergency ethnography. There is no time. It's happening in front of us. And if we wait for an ethics approval that takes 6 months or a year, then wala na yung research natin. So we must work with institutions to develop ways of research that allows us to be engaged with our interlocutors, humans and non-humans alike. I am sure many of you are already working on this. We just haven't had the time to talk about it. And I can't wait to read your papers. I do hope in the next UGAT conference, we'll have the opportunity to physically meet and form a panel or two or three about these things. Logistically, this can also lead us to engagement with other disciplines, not just within the social sciences, but with microbiologists, horticulturists, zoologists, physicians, and a host of many other fields, advocacies, and activisms. If the task at hand is strict description, and if it entails long-term observation, then we, as anthropologists, have a lot to offer, helping scientists, practitioners, farmers, fisher folk understand their own work, especially among those dealing with other species, while resisting the urge to view terms of engagement solely as terms of endearment. We need to trace these connections in a very engaged, very committed way. Finally, at a political level, it entails recognizing the power relations that underwrite, disrupt, destroy, and render antagonistic our relationships with other animals. The structural violence that not just exposes humans to harmful species, but exposes other species to human harm. Just as we ask who killed Baby River, we should also trace the web of causes that lead to the deaths of Philippine eagles like Pamana, tamaraws like Calabasas kindred, and many others that do not make it to the news. And let me also add the humans that are in the interface of environmental conservation, the forest rangers, the forest guards, who are very vulnerable and they also do not make it to the news. Those at the forefront of this, what they call post-human politics, are suggesting an attention to land and indigenous peoples as priorities in this direction. But this is something I think that we in the Philippines have always known, and we have really much to offer about articulating these connections. It also entails challenging the neoliberal order that renders not just humans vulnerable, but the whole planet, from the rising diabetes among our pets to the global warming that threatens not just humans or polar bears, but all kinds of species around the world. And of course, the pathogenic viruses that result from habitat destruction, the illegal wildlife trade, which should be ended right now, and the industrial farming as well. On the local scale, we also see this unfold in what Wolfram Dressler calls nature as capital, as when national parks that contain biodiversity is viewed solely in terms of market value. Surely, we anthropologists can speak to the debate about valuing and expanding our time-honored notions of reciprocity, kinship, to the nature culture around us. Perhaps it should also lead us to interrogating the symbolic taxonomies that render some species as worthy of compassion, others not. And it should also draw us attention to the badly needed rethink of our unsustainable ways of life. Do we really need millions of rodents in farms just so that humans can have leather goods and fake eyelashes? And finally, the microbiopolitics. We should discern this microbiopolitics and how political leaders invoke the virus, invoke different species to enact authoritarianism. If indeed the capital C coronavirus were as large as a human, I will not slap it. Instead, I will ask it if it knows how many crimes are being committed in its name. And so in ending, the question remains, how can we live together in precarious times? But as both a call to action and a provocation, let me add a couple more questions to end this presentation. First, mindful of Kurt Tandog's invocation of the has at the start of this pandemic, we should ask, how can we bear witness to forms of more than human togetherness, from use to affection, in ways that lead to action, in ways that do justice to humans and other species? And second, and finally, to return to anthropology's core mission, how do we do this in ways that allow us to deepen our understanding of what it means to be human in a more than human world? So thank you for joining me this morning. I now end my presentation. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Gideon, for that exciting lecture.
Yes, and let me, by the way, all the literature I mentioned are available. I created a Google Drive folder. So there's this QR code here. I can also share the link later. I've uploaded some of the works that I've cited in that folder.
Thank you, Gideon. Yeah, it's Gideon's presentation hopefully will inspire young anthropologists to look into that whole field, no, of multi-species ethnography. There's this misconception that anthropology is mostly focused on humans, but Gideon showed us that it's actually humans' relationships, you know, with non-humans. Is also very important, especially today. Before we proceed to Q&A, let us first listen to a message from our president, UGAT president, Ms. Susana Roldan.
Welcome participants to the UGAT 42nd conference. We were euphoric about the very successful face-to-face conference in Visayas last year when we began planning for this year's conference. The UGAT theme was supposed to be on the anthropology of encounters in anticipation of the marking of the 500th year of Spanish colonization in 1521, to be hosted by the University of San Carlos. But the universe had other plans for us as we ended up encountering SARS-CoV-2, more familiarly referred to as COVID-19. Much as we want the global pandemic to be over, we were all confronted by this historical moment felt by all of us. It is no surprise that the themes of the organically organized activities converge around the theme of encountering COVID-19 in varying contexts. In Luzon, Anthropology of Encounters, convened by Melvin Havar, Jesse Vargas Jr., Eileen Mijares, and Skiltila Bastillas, meant 2 webinars encountering COVID and 2 webinars on topics we could not let go. One webinar on collaborative research in a seascape comes from a growing interest in maritime anthropology, given our archipelagic country, and a continuing conversation on IP education integration that UGAT has been called upon to assist, given the research and engagement of the founding elders and members. Mindanao's regional conference is on Encountering the COVID-19 virus in Mindanao, People's Responses to the Pandemic, convened by Augusto Gatmaytan. Visayas Regional Conference, Encountering Colonization and the Pandemic in the Visayas, Local Experiences and Responses, convened by Zona Hildegard Amper, Enrique Oracion, Jose Eleazar Bersales, kept with the intended theme, including today's unraveling future history. We bring you this year's conference slated from November 16 to 28, 2020, hosted by different institutions in 3 regions where UGAT board and active members of the organization are found. Profuse thanks to all the host institutions, the La Salle University Social Development Research Center, and Ateneo de Manila University's Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Anthropological and Sociological Initiatives of the Ateneo in Luzon, Ateneo de Davao University in Mindanao, and University of San Carlos in Cebu for accommodating us and for making this conference possible. Our deepest gratitude. Despite the difficulty of dealing with the pandemic, I commend the working board and the active UGAT members for keeping it together despite dealing with their personal issues such as death or sickness in the family, restoring health and well-being, coping with shifts in online-offline lives, job insecurity, caring for others, and staying afloat with problems during such a challenging year. Thank you, conveners, speakers, moderators, and participants for agreeing to take part in UGAT's 42nd conference. This conference reflects the fighting spirit, hard work, and the hopes of people to overcome our encounters of today.
All right. Thank you, Suyan, for the message. Now we will proceed to the Q&A part of the program. Our first question comes from, I believe this is from Dennis Erasga. Now that we're able to operationalize the interspecies nexus, how do we actualize its major takeaways beyond the exemptionalism paradigm?
Hello, Dennis. Thank you for that question. That's a very, very important question because the very idea of Anthropocene has been challenged as human-centric, which it is. In a way, those proponents of the concept of Anthropocene suggest that we really need to acknowledge that we are exceptional in the harm that we have done to the planet and our impact in the planet. But some of the proposals that I have seen, both methodologically and theoretically, is really to pay attention more into the relations of different species and not just focusing on one or two, but being explicit in its relationality. However, this is really difficult because ultimately we might end up falling back on humans. We might ultimately fall back on discourse even. So logistically, I think the most useful way to think about it, to approach it when we do our research, is to think of the concepts that privilege humans, including language, for example. The moment our particularity in our method centers on language, then we all immediately privilege a kind of human mode of engagement as compared to other ways of engaging, other forms of sociality even. But at the same time, I also think that this approach might also lead us to ways of thinking just by taking this approach in upfront and not worrying too much about where it will lead us. So when we think of the theory, it can really be quite heavy to grapple with. But if we become grounded and simply use this multi-species perspective as a starting point, but not as an end point, then it can take us to other ways of understanding and theorizing. I also see in the comment, I'm reading a comment here about animal, beyond linguistics. So that I really like what Dennis pointed out, that how do we move beyond linguistic representation? Certainly, that involves us looking not as bacteria as discourse or visualization, but really taking them seriously. We know, for example, that COVID-19 is different from SARS in 2003. because SARS in 2003 did not have asymptomatic transmission, or not that they know of. There was no way of knowing anyway, but they really conceptualized SARS as a virus that has symptoms. And that shaped the way the whole pandemic, it did not even reach pandemic levels at the time, but the whole outbreak was organized based on this viral property of not causing of causing symptoms in humans, whereas COVID-19 can be asymptomatic, and it gives rise to all kinds of testing regimes, all kinds of concerns. So we need to look at these microbes and what they actually do as real agents, as opposed to merely tropes that people talk about. Without denying that they can also serve as tropes. They can be political tropes. They can be imagined in ways that do not correspond with how they are enacted in microbiology and in medicine. So I think we really need to take them seriously, and we cannot do that without alliances with people who do work in them. So some of the more rigorous works I've seen that look at viruses, for example, Cecilia Low in Indonesia, really followed experts, how they convene, how they agree on what this virus is, microbiology labs, and policy people, how they formulate policies around the virus. So it has to be done. We're not experts in this alone, so we cannot do this by ourselves. We have to rely on these engagements with people who are with these non-human species.
All right. The next question, I think Gideon also answered the follow-up question of Dennis, so thanks for that. The next question comes from Jesse Barquez, who's the executive director of UGAT. My questions concern about methodological and analytical aspects of multi-species perspective. How can we retool anthropological methods, which are largely designed anthropocentrically, to investigate multi-species? And then how can we analyze beyond interpretivist and anthropomorphist views in understanding multi-species?
The second question I also struggle with a lot, because I am now trying to
Oh no, sorry. Hello?
engage.
I
Yes.
think my connection. Yeah.
Okay. So yes.
Sorry, did
Thank
you
you.
get questions? My
Yes,
connection
I did.
went unstable.
Yes.
Okay.
I did. So thank you, Jesse, for these two questions. I join you in asking the second. It's something I also struggle with, because there's a lot of inherent anthropomorphism in what we do, and even when we try to animate plants, we do it in our own terms. We ascribe human emotions, we ascribe human actions in that. So our very methods are colored by our humanness, so to speak. However, what I found useful to methodologically is to follow the approach that we've done with how we look at chemicals. For example, in the Philippines, we were inspired by my advisor Anita Hardon and Arjun Apaduray's Social Life of Things approach of following things as they travel. So that is something that is highly amenable, I think, for multi-species work, following plants as they travel from. So, for example, this plant, it's moved to me. It's here and it's growing with these leaves, but it did not arrive here by accident. It's a product of a trajectory. There's a journey behind this, and by foregrounding how the plant itself moves from one place to another, from one ecological site to another, and even through airplanes, Lazada delivery vehicles, tricycles, then we can overcome some of the methodological challenges. So, in other words, I think multi-species ethnography is inherently multi-sited, because there are movements that have to be accounted for. And as far as the interpretivism that is difficult to overcome, I think that some of the based on the readings that I have also reviewed, they were really upfront about their limitations around this, and that helped them position themselves with other species. However, I think that even though we might be theoretically challenged to talk about other species, I think the core anthropological methods of participant observation remains highly salient for whatever. We just have to retrain our lenses to account for non-humans. Like, it's very possible for people to pass through the same park and says that it's a deserted park. But if we look at it from this multi-species perspective, then we can see all kinds of activity happening. So it's just a matter of accounting for them. That in itself can be productive already, I think. And we have to share experiences. Some of our participants, I think, have done work around this as well. So we really have to talk more about this. Maybe hopefully in the next UGAT conference, we can physically discuss, because there's so much insight from our colleagues as well.
Thanks, Gideon. I agree. Now we can explore how our next conference can incorporate this topic. The next question comes from Aaron, related to the earlier questions. Now, do you think the Philippines is ready for a multi-species perspective, not just in anthropology, but also in other topics as well, such as ethics? Because a multi-species perspective demands us to flatten hierarchizations of beings where humans emerge as top. Hence, adapting thinking would entail accountability for animal rights, such as well, which I think is difficult in a society such as Philippines, where the human and non-human is much quote unquote leakier.
Yes. So this question, and Aaron, Phil, thank you for this question. I want to go back to the development of multi-species ethnography and how the genealogy actually comes from two different streams. So one from post-critical studies, STS studies, but animal studies is also a parent to this whole movement. But the difference between these two streams thinking, although they're very related, there's one difference, which is the other one has infused some of this post-human politics with a kind of attempt to advance the animal rights movement. So there's an implicit statement here that indeed, if we're going to flatten this relationship in terms of anthropology, we cannot do that without flattening the ontological status and also even perhaps the moral status of different beings. However, and this is where anthropology comes in, I think we can adjudicate these different perspectives by also bringing in how people in the field actually engage with other species. And I go back to the work of Will Smith in Palawan, where he challenges, because human-pig relations, he finds, is not based on this idealized version of how humans engage with animals based on affection, but it's more complicated than that. They actually hunt for the pig, so it's based on, in a way, violence, but also based on marking territoriality and respect. So there are many themes around this. So rather than just be forced to commit that here in this realm of perspectives to advance animal rights, I think it's more productive for us to position ourselves as at the very least, as participant observers, as documenters of what is happening, and also as adjudicators of different perspectives, without limiting ourselves, of course, to adopt a positionality about this. I think that at the minimum, this perspective calls for a politics that demands accountability for human action that affects the whole planet and the environment. So that's my personal take. Feel that for me, it's the moral implication of this work that is really to point to demanding accountability. But to what extent this leads us is something for contestation and debate, including the taxonomy that we have for different species. So the ostrich, like I said, is worthy of affection, but the millions of minks are not. And how do we grapple with that? How do people make sense of that kind of double standard to animals?
All right. We have another follow-up comment from Dennis Rasga. Another area which could provide an equally facilitative breakthrough is eco-criticism in literature and environmental sociology.
Yes.
I saw someone, do you want to comment on that, Gideon?
Yes, I agree, Dennis. Definitely. Okay. And I have omitted one glaring omission in my talk is bringing in the humanities. I think definitely that has to be accounted for. I remember when we had this book launch with Padma on her work on green entanglements. This was really brought up, and that matters a lot. So sometimes we social scientists always look at the biological sciences, the medical sciences as collaborators, but in fact, we also are part of the humanities. We have to embrace the humanities as part of this, and also history. There's a lot of historical and folkloric works that we can tap into to bring about a more local understanding of multi-species perspective.
I saw Roland Casiano raise his hand. Can you see if is Roland here in the room? Not sure if you can unmute yourself. While waiting for Roland, maybe we can welcome other questions.
Actually, I'd like to hear from some of the people I've referenced, like Nota about cats and even Phil about the zoo. I wonder, can you share with us also how you're doing work around multi-species perspectives? I hope we can hear from someone as well.
Not can unmute herself.
Yes. Yeah. Good morning, Dr. Lasco. There's a lag. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, in my brief work with cats, I find the problematic parallel with when you study viruses, they're always, or with any species, it's always bound to the knowing of the human. Hindi tayo makalikas sa centrality ng focus on what it means for the human, and we cannot pretend, on the other hand naman, that we can know what these other species are all about or how they interact with the world. We can only know from our own point of view. But a parallel that I notice with cats is the emphasis on how harmful they are, just like a virus, no? How harmful they are. Whereas they also have other benefits for humans. So apparently, when we talk about them, it's always really stuck on our own perspective and the utility that we find at the moment. So in the moment of pandemic, ang utility natin is to get rid of the thing that causes the illness. When it comes to cats, get rid of the thing that kills a lot of birds, like millions of birds all over the world. So yeah, that's kind of a problem too, because they also have benefits. They have functions for life in general. Yun lang, these are my initial thoughts.
Thanks, Noti. Phil, Gideon was asking if you would like to share as well. I'm still asking if participants can unmute themselves. Hindi na, not disabled na yata yung unmuting. But feel free to type your questions.
Hi. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Actually, I was listening sa FB and
Okay.
kaka-enter ko lang. So yeah,
Sure.
actually ako yung nagtanong nung about yung problem nung leaky boundary natin doon sa pagkakaunawa natin doon sa human-animal divide, no? Kasi it's something that I've been dealing with, especially sa pandemic, na ang dami-daming mga taong tinatratong parang mga hayop. Tapos parang nagsusulat, tapos parang there's something cruel about me writing. Parang nakaka-guilty na magsulat about sa mga animals when all of these people ay tinatrato ng parang mga hayop at may mga taong umaastang hayop. So, yeah, sa tingin ko, maganda yung sinabi ni Sir na yun nga, pwede nating i-adapt yung position na participant observer lang din tayo sa gantong kind of cosmos, and marami pang mga situations na situations na hindi naman sila nag-a-adapt doon sa ganong kind of Western style of thinking doon sa gantong mga binaries and hierarchies. Pwede rin, gusto ko lang din isama siguro na kailangan din nating i-account yung mga not really mga beings na alive, pero yung mga bagay na kailangan ding isama sa multi-species perspective yung mga bagay na hindi naman buhay. Kasi for example, more than, aside from yung contact ko halimbawa sa aso ko, meron din akong mga contact at patuloy na tumutulong sa akin para mag-survive sa pandemic, yung mga virtual animals, halimbawa sa games like Animal Crossing. So, and napapansin ko na ang laki-laki ng community na nagagawa nito doon online. As in, ang dami-daming groups na nagkakaroon pa ng mga black market about dun sa mga rare items. And very fascinating kasi nagiging strategy to for survival psychologically. So, ayun. And yung isa pa ay, sa tingin ko magiging problematic talaga yung mas magiging problematic at masalimuot pa yung racism sa mundo, especially na crucified halimbawa yung isang particular na ethnic group or race doon sa COVID-19. Kasi may sinasabi din si Susan Sontag, if I remember, doon sa AIDS and Metaphors or AIDS and Illness, na we tend to these nga or virus that might bring problem doon sa purity ng isang region. So matakot lang din na ano yung magiging aftermath nung mundo dahil doon sa pagdatingan nitong si COVID. So ayun lang, maraming salamat.
Thank you, Phil. All right. Maybe we'll have one or two more questions. Meron pa bang sa chat box? Let me check. From Jesse Barquez, insights are also coming from beyond social science and humanities. Some botanists are looking at ontological aspects, say like plants. Example, Monica Galliano's work. And then from Dennis, human selectivism, killing the unwanted and caring for the most beneficial. All right. If there are no other questions, maybe we can ask Gideon if you have like last words.
Sure. At this point, I would like to encourage people to do research during the time of pandemic. This is we hope that this is not, we hope this is once in a lifetime, diba? Parang we don't want to go through another pandemic. But this is also, we have to overcome. It's very challenging to overcome all the difficulties that are happening right now, especially with the people who teach. There are so many responsibilities on top of the pandemic that we face. But in terms of research, this is also a watershed moment for humanity. Things are changing. Things are unfolding. Culture change that we might have imagined as something that is a slow process. There's so many things happening right now that demand our lenses, including looking at the world from a multi-species perspective. So I encourage those who are doing work already, I encourage you to continue despite the difficulties. And those who are not currently doing research, it's understandable, and like I said, so many difficulties. But if you can do research, if you have ideas that you feel are worth pursuing right now, this is a rare opportunity to understand what's happening, the changes, because we're all about change as well, not just what people think, but how people change their ways of thinking and doing and being. So I encourage this, and UGAT can be a community, and it is a community of researchers. Feel free to reach out. Feel free to reach out to me and others, and I'm sure we'll be happy to help and to engage with you as well. So thank you, and thank you for all the questions as well this morning.
Thank you again, Dr. Gideon Lasco, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. Again, we would like to invite everyone to the rest of the Luzon Regional Conference events, as well as for those in Visayas and Mindanao. Please go to our website and our Facebook page, UGAT Facebook page, for details on this. Now you can see it on screen as well. These are the dates and the titles of the talks. Details on the Mindanao and Visayas regional conferences will be uploaded soon. So please watch out for those. Thank you very much. UGAT board, please stay in the room for discussions on preparations for the next days. Thank you again, Dr. Lasco and everyone.